Welcome back to another episode of the Constructive Liberty Podcast. This is an episode that I recorded back in November with Tony Brasunas, who is an independent reporter and an author, and we're talking about his new book, Red, White, and Blind. Now, I recorded this back in November, but I'm only releasing it now because his book is just coming out on January the 10th. So you've got about a week until that book is ready for purchase. I believe you can pre-order it, but I'm going to drop a link down in the show notes where you can go find it on Amazon. You're going to love what Tony has to say about the state of things in the U.S. today. We go deep into it. There's a lot of different things that we end up talking about, but just from his book here, how the father of propaganda convinced Americans to love bananas, World War I, and the color green. Why the notion of objective professional journalism was invented in the early 1900s. How the CIA placed agents in the media and why they likely still do. How to understand family and friends with any set of political views. Why today's social media censorship violates the First Amendment. And why fact-checking websites almost always fail. Now, we don't talk about all of those things. This is only like an hour-long podcast, but we do get into quite a few different things. Tony's a wealth of information. You're going to love the interview. Go check out the book. Link in the show notes. Do good work. I'm joined today by Tony Brasunas, who is an independent journalist who was once sacked by the HuffPo back in 2016 for covering the Democratic primary from the wrong perspective. So, Tony, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and kind of some of the events in your life that led you up to someone who got sacked by HuffPo for maybe having some wrong opinions that they thought about?
Yeah, sure. So I started writing about politics back in 2000. I mean, way back when I first was able to vote and started paying attention and began noticing in, the 2000s, the aughts, as they're called, that the media was often distorted. And I started about how different politicians were covered and other issues as well. And I started paying more attention. I started publishing a political web magazine. I was living in San Francisco at the time. And that went on for a while. What happened in 2016, it was actually started in 2015. I was paying attention to the primary between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. And I just published a piece on my own blog called, everybody's talking about privilege in the time, check your privilege is showing, all this kind of stuff, right? I think it's still out there, but it was really big in those days. And so I just thought it made more sense to say that, it may be a better indicator of your privilege if you don't have to support Bernie Sanders. In other words, if you don't need a $15 minimum wage, if you don't need your student debt canceled, if you don't need Medicare for all, if you don't need these things, maybe you have enough privilege that you're just fine. And so rather than the narrative in the mainstream media was that, you're privileged if you're not going to support Hillary Clinton. And so I wrote that up and I said, please, the title of the article was check your privilege if you can handle 8 more years of Hillary Clinton and the status quo. And I wasn't trying to make some huge point. It was a fairly straightforward point. The article wasn't even that long. But I got contacted by Huffington Post. The piece got shared a lot on social media. And somebody from Huffington Post contacted me and said, hey, do you want to come? Can we publish this at HuffPo and we'll make you a contributor on the site and everything like that. And so I said, sure. And so I came on board and I covered the primary from primarily a Bernie Sanders perspective. This is 2015 going into 2016. And there weren't that many people in the mainstream media at that time bringing that perspective. There was a huge abundance of the sort of Hillary Clinton DNC side perspective on the race. So my pieces a lot of times on Huffington Post got 10,000 views, 50,000 views, sometimes 100,000 views. It would be on the front page of Huffington Post. And that was fine. And it was going well. I wrote about a number of different articles, a number of different perspectives. There were issues with the voting machines way back then. People were suspicious. The exit polling didn't quite look correct. And so I wrote a few pieces about that. I covered, the way the Sanders campaign was able to raise money directly from people rather than using PACs and corporate donations. I wrote a whole bunch of different perspectives, and it was going fine, and my articles were doing well. And then on the eve of the convention, or getting very close to the convention, I wrote this article called, I think it was the deeper reasons that many independents will not support Hillary Clinton. And it was basically going into this idea of Hillary Clinton is not trusted as much as Bernie Sanders. And now that we know that Donald Trump has won the primary on the Republican side, and head-to-head polling, Bernie Sanders is doing better. And I think it has a lot to do with this trust issue. And so I wrote a piece about that. And in the piece, I mentioned some of the things about why Hillary Clinton's not seen as trustworthy. And some of those things maybe were controversial. I'm not really sure, but I wasn't trying to prove the point. I was just saying it's up to the superdelegates now. Neither of these two candidates has enough earned delegates to win the nomination. And since we know Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee, it makes more sense to nominate Bernie Sanders. So the superdelegates, these people that vote with 10,000 votes, the power of 10,000 ordinary humans, get to determine the nominee. So it should be Bernie Sanders. That would be my recommendation. So I published the piece on an evening, a couple of days before I went to the convention at maybe 8 p.m. And it already had 20 or 30,000 views. I went to bed, and I woke up in the morning and the piece was gone. It was just taken down, and I couldn't find it, and I couldn't even log in anymore. I was off of the contributor panel, and I never wrote the Huffington Post again. That was it.
Completely gone.
That's the story of me getting sacked at Huffington Post. And there is a chapter in my forthcoming book, Red, White, and Blind, about that specific experience, and how that experience of censorship really took me over the edge from having seen a lot of censorship and a lot of distortion to wanting to write a book about it and to really understand it. And so that's what I've done.
Yeah. Wow. It's crazy how, most people they're heavily biased on one side of the media or the other. And anytime, from somebody who I don't consume a lot of media. So you kind of see the different perspectives, like they're heavily biased one way or heavily biased the other way. And you obviously got into somebody's back there and put out a perspective they didn't like. So is that kind of what pushed you towards writing this book that you're working on, or was there more to that in between, 2016 leading up to now?
I mean, that was the experience that sort of kicked me off. I mean, as I was getting ready to write a book, I'd gone through the Sanders experience in 2016, and I realized I wanted to write about what I had seen. I also went to the convention, and I saw just a lot of deception and chicanery there at the convention, and ways in which what was presented to people on television about the primary and about the convention was very different than the actual experience. I was in Philadelphia that year. And so everything that I had seen that year in 2016 was sort of boiling over in my mind. And so I wanted to write a book. And I wasn't sure if the book was going to be, originally it was going to possibly be analyzing the political parties and how more often than not, they're in cahoots. Like this little piece of art above my head. I don't know if you can see it. I'll move my head out of the way.
Yeah.
You can kind of see there's a donkey on one side and there's an elephant on the other, and they're playing with this beach ball. Right. And in the middle are all the people, and the people are like, can we play with the beach ball? And they're like, no, you don't get to play with the beach ball.
Yeah, you don't get the beach ball.
Yeah. It's just the donkey and the elephant. They just sort of kick it back and forth. Right. So there's this sense that they're, they may oppose each other on certain issues, but at the end of the day, they're more in support of each other because they're in support of the status quo system that allows them to have the beach ball, and all the ordinary people kind of just stare in longing at it.
Yeah, I like that. I was wondering what that piece of art was, and now that you explain it, I can see. I like that. It's good.
Yeah, it was actually there's an artist near my home. I just was walking down the street one day near my home, and there was this little art gallery, and I went in and I talked to this artist, and she had made it. And I just was sort of like, that needs to be on my wall. So I bought her art. It was a really nice experience. So.
Yeah,
but anyway, yeah. So that was one thing, was thinking about the parties. I also was very interested in elections because I had witnessed the exit polling and I knew to some extent about the electronic voting machines. And so I was very compelled to write about that. But in the end, it was the third topic that I ended up writing about, which was the media, because I realized that it was the media that was actually what's the right word? It's not the traffic cop, it's the filter. The media is the filter, is the distortion that prevents us from actually examining how the two parties are sharing power and how the electronic voting machines may be manipulating our votes and things like that. So I didn't do the research into those, so I don't talk as much about the electronic voting machines and allegations of election fraud, although I'm fascinated by the topic, or the parties. So I spent instead, Red, White, and Blind is really about the media, and it's about censorship and distortion. And it's interesting. So I started writing the book in 2019, and I was about, just halfway through the first draft of the book, and then the whole pandemic thing happened in March of 2020, right? Wow. And so I started with a fairly compelling case that the media is distorted. There's a lot of censorship and propaganda, and there's disinformation and fake news and all these things. And then just while I was writing the book, watching the whole on in 2021 and in 2022 as well, just was stunning. I mean, the book just kept getting longer because I had to put more stuff in there because there's so much going on. So I finally had to just put a wrap on it. So it's a book. But yeah, that's what the book is about. And it's really trying to help people see and understand that we're all in a certain state of deception. I'm a smart guy. I'd like to think, I can, read things and I think about things from different perspectives. But that doesn't matter. Like, I'm not immune to the distortion. I'm not immune to the deception. We're all prey to it. And so that's what I call red, white, and blind.
Yeah, it seems like if you know that there's a distortion there, you can kind of guard yourself against it. But when you find something that you think you trust, then you're more susceptible to being deceived. But I'm really interested in the title, Red, White, and Blind. Like, go into what's behind that. Why blind?
Yeah, so it's kind of this exact point that we're in right now. It's this notion that we are all in a state of deception. We're all deceived to some extent, and we're all being, we're all being lied to in a certain sense. And so there's different types of deception. There's different types of what I call bias in the book. So there's what I call innocent bias, which is like the bias that you have just because, let me just turn that off there. There's the bias that we have because innocent bias is the bias I have just because of who I am, like how I was brought up, like my race and gender and, all of that kind of stuff, place of origin, sexual orientation, whatever you want to say, the whole identity stuff. That's innocent bias. We all have it. Everybody has their own biases based on what they, how they see the world. But then there's another kind of bias that I call systemic bias, which is the bias of whatever organization you're working for. So like if you're running a podcast here or I'm on the podcast, there's probably very little systemic bias. But like, let's say, in order to do an interview at StreamYard, you would have to do certain things, right? There might be some little bit of bias you might have in how you cover the news or interview me. But imagine that you're working at CNN or you're a writer at the New York Times or you're at Fox. The systemic bias is really thick. It's very strong, what you're allowed to say and what you're not. What's going to get you in trouble? What's going to get you promoted? What are the things that what are the things that will be filtered? If you talk about like the big pharmaceutical corporations on a show that's brought to you by Pfizer, do you think that you can have free reign to say whatever you want? No. So that's systemic bias. And that's a huge way in which the news is distorted. And then the third kind of bias I talk about is nefarious bias. And I don't know if this is the worst. I mean, systemic bias is pretty bad, but nefarious bias is actually people deliberately placing false stories. Like I wrote, there's a whole chapter in Red, White, and Blind about Operation Mockingbird, which went on in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s when the CIA was actually placing agents at major news organizations and deceiving people, like just flat out like placing stories. And that still goes on to this day. And so that I call nefarious bias. That's when there's an actual agenda that people are deliberately manipulating the news, planting news. So that's what Red, White, and Blind is. Red, White, and Blind is this idea of bringing all of this, all of these types of biases together to understand the way in which we're deceived. And we're all red, white, and blind to some extent, all of us Americans trying to figure out the world with this distorted media system we live in.
Yeah. So what kind of stories have been distorted or planted or what kind of stories have they used some of those biases against us with? Do you have any examples on that?
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's actually a huge part of the book is just specifically looking at stories after story after story. And I like to start with stories that are what I call nonpartisan or more like that, because I didn't want the book to be seen as, oh, this is the Democrat side saying that the right is, full of fake news, or this is the Republican side saying the Democrats are full of fake news. The idea is that because the distortion is on both sides, I look at both sides. And so I start the book off with the Jeffrey Epstein story and go right into this story and say, look, this went on for 20 years, right? This guy at the apex of power in the Western world was basically able to run just the most disgusting, reprehensible business you can imagine. I mean, kidnapping, sex trafficking, hundreds, possibly thousands of girls against their will, and for some of the most, despicable people, and for, people that we didn't even maybe knew were despicable, but now we know they took part in this, and they were, presidents and CEOs and actors and lawyers and the heads of big, banks and the whole 9 yards. And that this was able to go on for 20 years. That wasn't just because an accident or nobody thought to look at it, right? There was, and it wasn't just because it was Republicans or Democrats didn't want the story to come out. There was a concerted effort by elements in the media, elements in the intelligence community that didn't want this story to come out for some reason. And that's why it was able to be hidden for 20 years.
Yeah. So for something like that,
ask what is this? What force did this and why?
Right. Yeah. So for something like that, was that a trying to hide, maybe some skeletons in the closet, or was there a more nefarious thing behind not wanting the American people to know? Like what's kind of behind some of these things? Because I know if somebody gets in power and a story like that gets out, that's going to end their career. So that's one reason, maybe to crush a story like that. But like, what's kind of behind some of the reasons that they would put out some of this false information, or even, keep a story from coming out that's truth, but, they don't even want a false spin on it, because then people will start digging. Where does some of that go?
Well, so I can speak on the broad point of how it works. In terms of the specifics of the Epstein story, there are people that are more expert on the story itself, like Whitney Webb. I don't know if you've heard of her. She just came out with this 2-volume set called, I think it's One Nation Under Bribery or Under Blackmail. I think One Nation Under Blackmail it's called.
Heard that.
And I recommend that. But yeah, no, I mean, basically the reason that it goes on is because Jeffrey Epstein and that ring that he was running was involving some of the most powerful people in the Western world, or, the world as a whole. And yeah, people were being protected, or people, Jeffrey Epstein, one of the first things he said when he was finally apprehended is he got out there in front of the media and said, I have videos of just all of these people in compromising positions, because he had mansions in Miami and Paris and New York, New Mexico, I think. And then he had his own island called Little St. James in the Virgin Islands. I mean, it's just disgusting, the whole thing. And the place was just absolutely covered in cameras. And so he just has all this footage of Bill Clinton and Alan Dershowitz and Bill Gates and, most people deny that they were there, but there's enough records that you can kind of piece it together. They flew on his airplane and things like that, that he had information on these people that would have made them look really, really bad and make it impossible for them to stay in their position of power, or at least to stay in the public eye. I mean, if you think about these people that are, and we still don't have the full list. I mean, it's just a stunning case that they finally bring Epstein out, and then he supposedly kills himself in prison. Unclear if he's really dead, unclear if he killed himself or if somebody else killed him. So he never takes the stand and is asked who was actually there. Then they have Ghislaine Maxwell. So she's finally brought on the stand, and she is convicted. And even despite she's convicted, they never have her talk about who all the people were that actually exploited. When have you ever heard of a sex trafficking prosecution that doesn't talk about the people that were actually, the actual perpetrators of it? I mean, it's astounding that that's happened. So yeah, so it goes on. I mean, this level of protection. And the reason is because the media and the people that run the media are managing narratives. They're managing certain stories. And so if there's a certain story about a thing or a story about a person, they have to maintain it. So in the Jeffrey Epstein case, the whole story was very damaging to the power establishment. And so the story had to pretty much go away. So it was concealed for 20 years. It explodes. And then within a couple of weeks, it's gone again. but they can't put the bottle on it because then they get Ghislaine Maxwell and then it's gone again. Because they don't really want you to think about what this might mean about the power structure as a whole, and how the media was able, or why the media on both sides, right, concealed this story for so long. What that must mean they're concealing about other things.
Yeah. So you've got two sides there that are both concealing a thing like that, but there's a lot of other things that they take opposite perspectives or biases on. Is one worse or better than the other? Is there one that we can trust more?
You mean between like the red and the blue?
Right.
No, not really. I mean, what I recommend. So what I recommend is after in Red, White, and Blind, after going through all of these stories and demonstrate. So we talk about Jeffrey Epstein, then we talk about the origin of the coronavirus and why that. Ask the question about this came out of a lab. Then we go into some of the issues around the Trump election and when the Hunter Biden laptop story was suppressed. And then we go into a whole bunch of things. I obviously talk quite a bit about the Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton thing. And then I talk about the 2020 election as well. And then after all of that, and we've told a whole number of stories, we also talk about the water in Flint, Michigan, and the protests in Standing Rock, and a number of things to analyze in the media. We get to your question, which is like, okay, so is there a better set of media sources? Should we like go listen to Fox and sort of talk radio on the red side, or should we, pay attention to the New York Times and NPR on the blue side? And what I say is,
how can we be more informed? That was one of my questions. I think you're leading up to it. Like you have, obviously, hopefully you have some solutions where we can, find some good information.
Yeah, no, I have some good news as well. So the first solution that I propose is what I call a balanced media diet. And the idea is you acknowledge that you have your own biases, I have my own biases, news sources have their own biases. But that we can, so that the most intelligent way to approach this is that we have to develop what I call media consciousness. So media consciousness is, and this is the subtitle of the book, The Truth About Disinformation, The Path to Media Consciousness. Media consciousness is this idea that we don't just like take in news. We kind of take a moment and say, okay, who's saying this thing? Why are they saying it? What do they want me to feel? They want me to be worried. They want me to be outraged. They want me to be happy. And who, what are they not saying? Who gets to talk about it, right? Media consciousness is just this little, it's not some fancy thing. It's just this ability to, when somebody tells you something, think about it before you just take it in. Right. And so with media consciousness, and we develop a balanced media diet. So I propose a balanced diet, and I've sort of, in the book, I have 40 sources that I've come up with. Some of them are corporate media, some of them are independent media, and you read different sources each day. And that sort of helps you cultivate this media consciousness because you're going to be reading the New York Times or the Epoch Times or, NPR, and then you see different sides of issues. And then you can start to develop this media consciousness that allows you to understand the truth about things a little bit more of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, here's the good news is that we can do this much easier than we have ever been able to do this before. We're at the beginning of, or I would say we're even, maybe a decade into what I call a new enlightenment, because the internet has come along and it has radically opened up information to everyone. So like you and I can have this conversation right now. Ken can be sitting there. Tony can be sitting here. We can have a conversation. Nobody told us we could or we couldn't. We can upload it. You can put it up, and then it can be seen by 10 or 10,000 or 10 million or a billion people, right? There's no saying. It's just it's free for everyone, and that has never existed before. So the last time we had something like this, and I write about this in the book quite a bit, is we had the printing press, which came out in the 1400s and
revolutionized things.
It seemed like not a big deal. I mean, it's kind of, now you can move the words around and move the letters around, and you can print books a little bit cheaper, a little bit more quickly. But it revolutionized the world. It like dramatically changed how people could access information. Suddenly, way more people could read. Within less than 100 years, the number of people that could read in Europe was, more than tenfold. And then you had all these people writing books, and then you had people publishing their own books and talking. And that led to the Enlightenment. That led to the Renaissance. That led to the United States of America and France, and like these countries based on constitutions and based on freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, these things we take for granted now, those all were birthed by the development of the printing press. And so now we're in another phase like that. The internet is revolutionizing things even more than the printing press, because with the printing press, you still had to have, the ability to print. People still had, there's still quite a bit of who had money could do it. And maybe you can say that's still true with the internet, right? Not everybody in the world has the access to the internet. There's a lot of people that don't. But compared to anything that's come before it, right? It's like now suddenly you and I can have a conversation with somebody in Australia or South Africa or Egypt or Paraguay, whatever, like instantaneous. And so we can learn, it's possible to know the truth about anything. Let's say it's way more possible. It's way easier. It's still not easy, but it's way easier. It is in fact possible to know about anything at any time. And because of that, we have the possibility of doing this balanced media diet where like in the Middle Ages, right, it was just what the church said or the feudal lord said. That was the truth. The earth is the center of the galaxy. If you don't believe it, you're going to get burned at the stake. You're going to be thrown on the rack. And then, 100 years ago or even 50 years ago in this country, it was pretty much, whatever the ABC News or NBC News told you, that was the truth. And that's what's going on. The communists are going to come get you, and like the nuclear, there's like certain narratives, and that was the truth. And so we're moving into this world now. We're about 10 years into it, I'd say, where we are seeing a rapid change, the toppling of power structures, the power structures that have basically top down been able to tell us what is going on in the world, what we're supposed to think, what we're supposed to fear, what we're supposed to be happy about, who the bad guys are, who the good guys are, all that kind of stuff. It's falling apart. And now we're able to learn it for ourselves. And that is dramatically changing it. And that's why there's all this stuff about fake news and disinformation and misinformation. And you're getting taken down from YouTube and you're censored from Twitter because you said something that wasn't in line with the who or the this or the that. Yep. It's because they're trying to cling to their power. They don't want us to be able to just freely exchange with each other and say our own narrative. Actually, this is what I think is going on with this pandemic or COVID, or this is what I think is going on with the 2020 election.
It's like definitely like a dying beast thrashing around, taking out.
It is, and it's still powerful. It's going to be thrashing around for another 10 years, maybe 15. Yeah. I mean, but it's weakening. You look at the numbers each year. It's a little weaker. It's a little, but they're going to react and they're going to try to, a cornered beast. Yeah.
It's an incredible time when someone can build a podcast like Joe Rogan and he gets millions more views than all the major news sources combined. But there's a quote that I really like, and I can't remember who said it. He said, it's a mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain an idea without accepting it. And what you were saying about, looking at the different media or the stories from different sources and being able to really think about what they're trying to make me feel, and even going deeper into maybe who's benefiting from me feeling or thinking that way. It really gives you a new perspective on things. But kind of where do we go from here? Where does all that go? Does it continue to get more and more polarized as the beast tries to stay alive? They pit the people against each other more and more, or what happens from here?
That's a great question. And no, you just distilled, I think, really the essence, in a sense, of Red, White, and Blind, how you just sort of went through that, like where we're going or how we're getting here. So now where do we go from here? Yeah, I mean, I look back at that time, after the Enlightenment or right at that time, there was the Inquisition, so it's not always pretty, right? Like the existing power structures, they want to keep things. And so, in my darker moments, I look at the censorship, you look at people that are censored and you say, that's really worrisome, and you see what happens. There certainly is the potential that the censorship and the powers that be, they just lock everything down and they see what's coming and they're not going to let it happen. I don't think that's what's happening. I think there's an attempt to do that. But I think what we're going through this dying phase of these dinosaurs, and we get to be part of the solution. We get to basically hasten their demise by, so in the balanced media diet, there is corporate news. Like I do put some CNN in there, and there's some New York Times, there's some Fox News, because it's important to still be able to access that kind of news. It's also helpful for developing your own sort of bullshit detector, so to speak.
Right.
we develop media consciousness not only by trying on other sources, but by then looking at sources that maybe are deceiving and understanding why. So by adopting a balanced media diet and moving towards this thing I call media consciousness, and you can call it whatever you want, the idea is we move into, like what happened in the Enlightenment, we move more into trusting our own minds. And this is the birth of science. This is the birth of democracy, is the idea of the individual can figure things out for himself or herself. And you see the people that don't want that to happen. I mean, the New York Times had this article called Don't Go Down the Rabbit Hole that was published. It was like an opinion piece. It was, maybe 6 months ago or something, but it was a perfect distillation of their sense of like, don't think for yourself. Don't go read on your own. Don't do your own research, which is the complete opposite of the founding values of our civilization, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea of democracy and science is there is no truth, right? I mean, there is truth, but there's no a set of answers. Science is thinking. Science is a way of questioning, right? And democracy is not a set of answers. Democracy is a method to try to find the best government solution, given that you have selfish individuals who mostly just are going to go in their own self-interest, right? Same with science, right? They're these kind of like beautiful yet flawed systems that try to sort of triangulate towards the truth. And so when you see something like the New York Times saying, don't go down the rabbit hole, they're basically saying, we don't trust you to think on your own, because if you do that, you might stop believing us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like that. I was reading an article earlier that you wrote, and you likened a balanced media diet to a balanced food diet. And I don't know if you're familiar with the keto diet, where basically you cut out all carbs, everything sugars, and all of those things. I'm someone who's kind of taken that approach to the news media. Like, media is poison. I try not to watch or listen or hear, see anything, because I know it is so biased. What would you say to someone who is in a similar position? Is it important that we be, trying to keep up with things, or the way I've looked at it, if something happens that I need to hear about, I'll hear about it. Is that a valid viewpoint?
Yeah, I take that on at the very beginning of the book, because I think it's something people think about a lot. It's like, I opt out. I don't inhale or whatever, right? So in the balanced media diet, there is several levels of the diet, and there is what I call the sort of cleanse, like the fast, which I think is a fine response to do for a couple weeks at a time or whatever, when you just sort of take a chill. But no, there's no opting out, because what I basically point out is that the media is not just about the news. And it's not just about sports. It's not just about politics. It's about the narrative of our lives. It's basically the media wants to tell us through their analysis of current events what we want, what we should dream for, what we should hope for, what we should long for, what we should fear. And they're very effective at it. They've been developing it for 100 years, since the dawn of propaganda in the 19-teens. Edward Bernays, that whole thing, I talk about that a little bit. So this idea that we can opt out is, I'm not saying that we shouldn't at times, like I said, sort of have a cleanse diet, where like a keto, where I'm not going to watch CNN, or I'm not going to read the New York Times for a month or 2 weeks or something like that. I think that's fine and can be wise. But the idea that we can just sort of, for our life, for like a couple years at a time, just opt out, it's just not possible, because so first of all, you're absorbing all of this stuff, whether you want it to or not. The narrative is the water of our society. Like, the narrative is the story of our culture. We're fish swimming in the narrative, living in the United States. Whether it's the war in Russia, or it's the, Russiagate stuff, or it's COVID. Like, you can't just ignore it. Like, you can try to say, I'm not going to listen to the news about COVID. Yeah, it's going to affect your life whether you want it to or not. And what's going to happen is, if you think you're opting out, really what you're doing is you're opting out of media consciousness. And then what's happening is then they're actually programming you a little bit more. The other thing is that not all your friends are going to, right? And your family. So your friends, you're going to get it all through your friends and your family. So yeah, it would be nice to just opt out. But I liken that to sort of a Santa Claus view or something, where it's like, it would be nice if there was this old guy that kind of brought us gifts, and it'd be nice if there was a media source that would tell us the truth, or else just shut up about it or something like that. that's not the way it is. I see it's sort of like it's sort of a growing up into a mature experience of being an American citizen and saying, look, this stuff is everywhere. It's in it's where I work. It's where I live. The narrative that is crafted by the giant media corporations is the story. So the only way that you can, or I would say the best way to navigate it is through media consciousness, because those narratives are going to affect your life. We're all going to go through life. We're going to make big decisions in our life. We're going to decide where to live, what career to pursue, whether to get married, whether to have kids, whether to get a vaccine, whether to travel, have an abortion, all these like hot button things, own a gun, right? All this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If we make these decisions without consciousness about the narrative, about how we're supposed to think about those things, then we are being conditioned to think about those things a particular way. Media consciousness allows you to understand the truth a little bit more. And so when we make those important decisions in our life, we can make them, more wisely and I would say live a better life.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that explanation. That's good. Do you don't happen to have the book with you to share a passage with us, do you? A little reading from it?
I do. I would love to do that, actually. I have I've just gotten in the advanced review copy. So the book will be out January 10th. I just want to let everybody know the date. You can go to redwhiteandblind.com to see, to get the latest. TonyBrasunas.com is where my blog is. But yeah, let me read a little bit of the book. I think that would be great. So I'm just going to start here with the introduction. And this is the Jeffrey Epstein passage. Unless we just talked about Jeffrey Epstein, would you rather hear a different passage? This is
it's up to you. Just read, anything. It's up to you. That's cool.
Let's start with this. So this is the introduction of the book. So this is the very first couple pages. So if you read the book, it'll start right here. Introduction. We will know our disinformation campaign has been successful when everything the American people believe is false. And that's a quote by William Casey, director of the CIA, 1981 to 1987. Virginia Roberts folded 8 white towels into stacks, ensuring the seams lined up and the spa's floral logo appeared in the corner. She placed the stacked towels on a polished granite countertop. There were no customers, so she tied her blonde hair into a ponytail and resumed reading where she had left off, in an illustrated guide to massage therapy. She found the book fascinating. I'm only 15, she reminded herself. But she had a goal now, to ascend from mere attendant at the luxurious Mar-a-Lago resort to real professional massage therapist. A woman with pointy black locks of hair appeared. Virginia offered the woman tea, as she always did, and asked politely whether she had an appointment. The woman didn't have an appointment, but she accepted the tea. With a friendly smile and with a proper English accent, the woman asked Virginia several questions about the spa, before she asked about her copious notes in the massage book. With a bashful smile, Virginia shared her goal. The woman told Virginia that her boss was a wealthy man, and as it turned out, he was looking for a massage therapist for his frequent jet trips around the world. He would pay for her training if Virginia showed the right enthusiasm for the job. The woman handed Virginia her card and introduced herself. Her name was Ghislaine Maxwell. It was June 2000, and a 3-year nightmare was about to unfold for Virginia as she followed in the path of dozens, perhaps hundreds or even thousands, of young girls who were abused by Jeffrey Epstein. Later that warm summer night, Virginia visited Epstein's Palm Beach mansion, as many of the unfortunate girls did before they accompanied him to Paris, New York, London, and Little St. James, Epstein's private island in the Virgin Islands. The girls were offered as sexual property, escorts, and quote-unquote massage therapists to some of the world's most wealthy and powerful men. Millionaires and billionaires, former presidents and foreign royalty, senators and judges, hedge fund tycoons and Hollywood producers, powerful attorneys and famous actors, chairmen of boards and CEOs of giant conglomerates. They all flew on Epstein's plush private plane. The plane was nicknamed the Lolita Express. Ascending from a resort attendant to a professional massage therapist was not in the cards for Virginia. Shortly after that night, as she tells the story, she was forced to have sex with Prince Andrew of England, famed attorney Alan Dershowitz, and many others. Those known to have flown on Epstein's jet many times include Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, Donald Trump, and countless others. No legal action was brought against Epstein for years. The first case brought against him occurred in 2005 when a different girl's mother brought charges of sexual assault on behalf of her daughter. Many other victims came forward immediately thereafter, revealing Epstein had been running a pedophilia rape ring since at least 1993. Local law enforcement amassed a litany of evidence and multiple witnesses. It looked like a slam dunk case. Epstein faced life in prison for sex trafficking. What ensued was one of the saddest chapters in American legal and media history. The FBI stepped in and took over the case from local Florida law enforcement. The federal testimony from the victims and families, but chose to use a grand jury, which protected Epstein from the most threatening charges. Epstein's powerful attorneys, including Alan Dershowitz, who himself was a frequent traveler on the Lolita Express, secured a highly unusual non-prosecution, quote unquote, from U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta. It was a sweetheart deal that required him to plead guilty to just one charge at the state level. In exchange, Acosta granted Epstein immunity and canceled an FBI probe into his activities. How is this possible? Acosta claimed orders had, quote unquote, come from above, that were, quote, above his pay grade, unquote. National media coverage was nowhere to be found. A New York Magazine piece entitled "Billionaires Are Free" was one of few national pieces on Epstein at the time, and it vindicated him with a shockingly permissive boys will be boys attitude. And that was that. The national media uncharacteristically dropped a story about sex and famous people. Indeed, the media ran away from the matter of a major sex trafficking ring as if from an infectious virus. Epstein had to register as a sex offender following the non-prosecution, but 8 years later, he was still somehow flying on his personal jet with, quote, very young girls, unquote, to his private Caribbean island on a weekly basis. It was as if he had never been convicted at all. The media stayed silent. Years later, after Virginia finally escaped Epstein's clutches, she married an Australian and took her new husband's name, Geoffrey. The birth of her daughter prompted her to overcome her shame and speak out. A 139-page expose about her experience, submitted as evidence against Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell in 2015, was unsealed years later. In the meantime, Virginia contacted national news organizations, and in 2016, she spoke directly with ABC News host Amy Robach. Robach was intrigued, and she took up the story. She arranged a flight to New York for Virginia, and Virginia felt confident enough to tell Robach the whole horrifying story in person and on the record. Robach recorded it all and spent hours preparing a report on the bombshell revelations. The story would finally expose Epstein for what he had done. ABC News never ran the story. No corporate media channel picked it up despite Virginia's dogged efforts. If the main priority of American news organizations is to generate clicks and views, as many Americans believe, this story was surely a godsend. But they all ignored it. Why? We will answer this question in this book.
Wow. If that doesn't make your blood boil, then you're not even human. That's wow. That's powerful. I like it. What else would you share about the book before we wrap it up?
Yeah. So let's see. So the book is basically, I think of it as four things. If you're interested in these four things, you'll probably enjoy the book. So one is an expose about the media and stories like what I just did with Jeffrey Epstein, sort of looking at stories and then looking at how the media covered it and sort of displaying the level of distortion. Then the second part of the book is history. We go a little bit further back. We look at Operation Mockingbird. We look at the origins of propaganda, and we even look at the start of the newspapers and the origin of the printing press. So you can sort of understand the larger where we are in history. And then the third thing is the solution, and I sort of talked about that, the balanced media diet, and seeing that we're in a new enlightenment. And we are in an unparalleled position in history where we are seeing our own access to information expand. And so we can leave the state of red, white, and blind. We can gain this media consciousness and understand not just what's going on in the news, but also be able to connect with people across the spectrum. When you read a balanced media diet, in addition to media consciousness and all the other stuff we've talked about, one of the great benefits, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, is you can connect and you can understand other people. You don't necessarily have to take on their views, on a controversial issue like war in Ukraine or gun rights or abortion or vaccines, whatever it is, but you can understand that viewpoint. And so this whole idea of divide and conquer, which has always been used to try to keep people away from the power that they naturally are entitled to, it doesn't work as well, because now you can reconnect with your aunt or your daughter or your husband or whoever it is, right? You can connect with these people, you can understand that viewpoint. So that's the third part of the book. And then the final piece is sort of a little bit of a pep talk, I guess. The last chapter, I just sort of talk about the future and where I see it going, and where I see these different phases of the internet, what I call the internet age, unfolding as we go through these different phases. And I also talk quite a bit in the book about censorship and social media. I take a lot of time, a couple chapters, to look at social media. So if those are topics you think would be interested, then by all means, please find the book.
Yeah, awesome. I wanted to ask you one more question though. Just remembered, you've been an independent journalist for, you said, since about 2000?
Yeah.
What's that business model like? I'm sure that's changed over the last few years. Is that something that you're able to support yourself with, or if more people want to kind of get in that field to help, stop the spread of the disinformation or the, help others overcome the bias, what's kind of the business model to go for there?
That's a great question. And I don't spend as much time in the book as maybe I should, but I do look at several business models near the end of the book and sort of propose that, because it's true. We're moving into a new media age. We don't know exactly. We know that the current business model is broken. It's leading to all this systemic bias with these 5 giant corporations that basically control everything we think, or they try to, and we have to fight back. So I talk about a couple different business models. So the 3 that I propose as we go into this next phase of the whole information internet age, the first one is subscriber model, like a subscriber base. And I think this is already functioning quite well for some, although I don't think it's alone is enough. But this is where, you go on your Substack or your Patreon, or there's all these different places, and you get the people that enjoy what you're doing. They send you $2 or $5 or $10 or $20 a month or whatever they can afford. And then in return, they get some more of your content and stuff like that, and they can support you. And there's definitely a lot of different flavors of this model. But I think it's a great model. I think it absolutely deserves our support. And so I do even say in the Balanced Media chapter, I say, give me an hour a day, or give yourself really an hour a day for 40 sources, and give yourself $20 a month. And, people have different amounts of money that they can afford, but if you could put aside $20 a month to support independent alternative media, that if enough of us did that would solve the whole problem. Right. So that's the first model. And I think it's possibly the best model, but I'm not sure it's totally going to work, because a lot of people they're not yet prepared to send $5 a month.
We're too used to free stuff.
People are used to free, and it's not that that's bad, and I don't want people to feel guilty. But if there's a particular person you like, if you like whatever it is, whatever particular source you're into, send them $5 a month or $10 a month or $20 a month, whatever you can, or $1 a month, whatever it is, because then what you get out of that is you become a little bit more opted in to follow their perspective, and you also support them so that they can do a better job. So that's the first model. The second model is the advertiser model. And to some extent, the advertiser model has created problems in our current system. It is responsible for systemic bias. Like when I talked about Pfizer sponsoring CNN show, and then the CNN show saying, let's go look at these, COVID vaccines and see how they work. Sponsored by Pfizer, who's making billions of dollars, right? That it's not, that it's biased. So, but on the other hand, the advertiser model has been around since the founding of this country. It's been around as part of the freedom of the press. So we don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you can get advertisers and you're completely transparent about who they are, you disclose it to people, you're conscious of the bias they may have, you're aware of the systemic bias, and you disclose it, I think that model is still workable. So, you'll go on and watch, like you were talking about, you just talked about the great big podcast guy, Joe Rogan.
Joe Rogan, yeah.
Yeah, blank there for a minute. So Joe Rogan, right? You'll go to, or like, and they'll be like, sponsored by NordVPN or something. Sometimes there'll be just the sponsorship, and I don't think that that's the whole solution either. But I think that deserves a role as long as it's done responsibly. The third business model I talk about is maybe this one's a little more controversial, but I think it has also great potential, and it would be a role of the government in supporting independent media. And about it, but you study the history of the free press, and you know that Congress enacted the lowest postage rates for periodicals throughout the 1800s, so that you could mail a newspaper through the mail for a penny, and they did that specifically because the press is mentioned in the Constitution. It's the only non-political role mentioned in the Constitution. It's absolutely essential for democracy. We have to have the watchdog, role. And so the government recognized that. And so today, to expand that, you could do something where, like possibly on your tax return or something, some form, each American would get like $100 in coupons that they would then distribute to the independent the news sources of their choice. So they could send all $100 to the New York Times, or they could send $1 to Tony Brasunas and $1 to Ken and $1 to, Joe Rogan. They could do whatever they wanted. And as long as the government had no role in choosing the list, right, the list of your possible choices, the list would be infinite. There wouldn't be like a list of whoever wanted to enter their name, throw their hat in the ring as a journalist, then you're on the list and you can receive the coupons. I think that has a lot of potential. It's obviously more complicated than the other two, and we'd have to really, spend some time thinking it through. But those are three business models that I talk about that I think have real potential. And as we see these dinosaurs dying, I think certainly the first two and some version of the third, I think will start to take shape.
Yeah, gotcha.
For myself personally, because you asked about me personally, so I have been an independent journalist for a long time, but I've had a second career alongside it. I also do other things. I do some computer programming and things. And I'm just somebody that I have to do multiple things at once. I get bored if I'm doing one thing. And I also realize if I was trying to make money off the journalism only, I might not do it with as much, interest and joy. That's my own personal thing. And I know there was a media conference with Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone. Or that's one of the really good independent media sources out there these days. And they were asked this question, and they both said, we're doing this as our only thing, and we're making a living at it, but it's hard, and we don't recommend it. So it's like if you literally can't not do it, if it's like you're drawn to do it, then you will make a living at it. You'll just have to put everything you have into it. But if you can do something else alongside it, I recommend that, because then that'll take off some of the stress of like you have to pay the bills and support your family through independent media, which is challenging. There are many people doing it, but it's really challenging.
Right. Yeah, I can see how that would be super difficult, because what gets you into it is your interest in a certain thing. And to go full time in that, you got to cover a wider variety of things. So I can see how that would be a lot more difficult. So, Tony, where can people find you and follow you if they want to keep up with you? And then I know you mentioned the website where they can buy the book, and I'll put that in the show notes, but where can they connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tony Brasunas, if you can spell my last name, Brasunas. I'm Tony Brasunas on Twitter. I'm Tony Brasunas on Facebook, and I'm moderately active in both places. I have a Substack, which I publish on more or less weekly, or at least every other week. I publish something that'll probably be even more as we get close to the book release. And that's redwhiteandblind.substack.com. So those are the best places to find me. And then, of course, TonyBrasunas.com is my sort of my central hub. That's my blog. So, yeah, and I'm out here in California. You can also come find me here in person, knock on the door, and say hi.
All right, cool. Well, hey, I appreciate your time. This has been a good conversation.
Likewise, Ken, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet.